When you live in a neighborhood governed by a homeowners association, you often expect a certain level of order and predictability. Rules about lawn care, approved paint colors, and trash collection schedules are usually what people think of. But for one homeowner, a man who had recently gone through life-altering circumstances, the HOA would become something far darker. It began with something as simple, as practical, and as necessary as a wheelchair ramp. The man had lived in his home for over a decade. It was a modest property. Nothing extravagant, just a comfortable single-family home in a suburban culture. His life had been steady until a devastating car accident left him partially paralyzed. Doctors told him he would never walk unassisted again. Overnight, stairs became insurmountable obstacles, and tasks that once required no thought now demanded complete planning. His home, once his sanctuary, had become a fortress that seemed impossible to enter. Faced with this, he knew what had to be done. He arranged for a contractor to build a sturdy wheelchair ramp at the front of his house. It wasn't ornamental. It wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Without the ramp, he couldn't leave his home safely. Friends and family helped raise the funds, and within weeks, the ramp was installed. The sense of independence it brought back to him was immeasurable. For the first time since the accident, he felt a glimmer of freedom. But that freedom didn't last long. The HOA board, a group infamous in the neighborhood for their rigid enforcement of rules, noticed the new construction. They weren't known for compassion. They were known for citations and fines. To them, the ramp wasn't a symbol of accessibility or necessity, it was an unauthorized structure. They claimed it violated the community's uniform appearance standards. It didn't matter that the ramp was professionally built, that it was safe, or that it matched the home's exterior. To the HOA, it was an eyesore, and they weren't going to tolerate it. The first letter arrived within days. A formal notice demanded that the ramp be removed immediately or face daily fines. The tone was cold, clinical, and utterly detached from the reality of his situation. It didn't acknowledge his disability. It didn't ask questions. It didn't show empathy. It simply listed non-compliance and warned of escalating penalties. At first, he thought it must be a mistake. Surely, they would understand once they realized the ramp wasn't an optional addition, but a medical necessity. He reached out, explaining his circumstances, including documentation from his doctor. He even referenced federal accessibility laws, hoping that logic would prevail. But the HOA board wasn't interested in logic. They doubled down. Weeks passed, and the letters grew more aggressive. The HOA began issuing fines, adding them to his account balance, threatening liens against his home. They insisted that the ramp destroyed the uniformity of the community. They claimed it reduced property values. They spoke as if aesthetics outweighed basic human dignity. Neighbors began whispering. Some sympathized quietly, while others sided with the HOA, fearing that standing against them would invite scrutiny on their own properties. The man's life, already complicated by his disability, was now consumed by a battle he never wanted. He tried to reason, but the board members, led by a particularly inflexible president, treated him like a rule breaker. Behind closed doors, he heard rumors that the president had bragged about making an example out of him. They wanted to show the community that no one was above the bylaw. And yet, the HOA had underestimated something crucial. He wasn't going to give up. The ramp was not a decoration he could simply take down. It was his lifeline, his only means of entering and leaving his home with dignity. He knew that removing it would trap him inside, effectively imprisoning him. And deep down, something in him snapped. If the HOA wanted to make this a battle, then a battle they would have. He began documenting everything, every letter, every fine, every interaction. He kept meticulous records, saving copies of medical notes, photographs of the ramp, and even recordings of conversations where board members dismissed his concerns. He researched disability rights laws late into the night, learning about the Americans with Disabilities Act and state-level protections. The more he read, the more he realized just how wrong the HOA was. By the time the board issued their final threat, complete removal of the ramp within 30 days or legal action, he was ready. But instead of crumbling under the weight of their pressure, he made a phone call that would change everything. He contacted an attorney specializing in disability rights and housing discrimination. The lawyer listened, reviewed the evidence, and agreed immediately. This wasn't just a petty HOA dispute. This was a textbook case of discrimination. The ramp, which had started as a symbol of his personal survival, was now about to become the centerpiece of a legal war. And as the deadline set by the HOA loomed closer, he prepared himself for what was coming. The HOA believed they had power over him, but they had no idea the storm they had just invited into their pristine little neighborhood. The fight was about to escalate from fines and letters to courtrooms and legal precedents. The HOA thought they were defending aesthetics, but they were about to learn the price of ignoring the law. The 30-day deadline passed. The ramp remained, and the HOA made their move. When the 30-day deadline came and went, the ramp still stood strong in front of his house. It was a quiet act of defiance, but one that spoke louder than any words could. To the man, it meant freedom. To the HOA, it meant insubordination. They were not going to tolerate being ignored. The next letter didn't come in the usual tone of fines or warnings. It came in the form of a legal notice, thick with paperwork, stamped by the county clerk. The HOA had filed a lawsuit. Their claim that it was in violation of community bylaws and had refused compliance despite repeated warnings. They argued that the ramp was an unapproved modification, one that threatened property values, set a bad precedent, and went against the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. It was the culmination of everything they had threatened, and now they were moving with the full weight of the association's resources. For most homeowners, facing an HOA lawsuit is terrifying. HOAs have collective funds, pooled from the dues of every resident. That money is often used to hire aggressive attorneys who specialize in enforcing community covenants. Most residents simply fold under the pressure, unable to match the financial firepower. But this time, the HOA had picked the wrong fight. The man had already hired his disability rights attorney, a sharp, determined individual who had seen cases like this before. To her, the HOA's lawsuit wasn't intimidating. It was an opportunity. She pored over the association's complaint and quickly identified its flaws. The HOA had built their entire case around aesthetic rules and community standards, but nowhere did they acknowledge federal or state accessibility protections. By ignoring disability law altogether, they had set themselves up for disaster. The first step was filing a response. The attorney crafted a counterclaim, not only defending the man's right to keep his ramp, but also accusing the HOA of discrimination under the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. She argued that the HOA had failed to provide reasonable accommodations for a person with a disability, a direct violation of the law. The man watched as the case unfolded on paper, line by line, legal argument by legal argument. It was no longer just about his ramp. It was about principle. His lawyer explained that if they won, it could set an example that other HOAs around the country would have to take seriously. Suddenly, what had started as a neighborhood dispute was shaping into a battle with national implications. The HOA board was blindsided by the counterclaim. They had expected him to fold or quietly settle. Instead, they found themselves accused of something far worse than rule-breaking. They were now the defendants in a discrimination case. And while they still tried to project confidence, cracks began to show in their polished exterior. Some board members started questioning the president's aggressive stance. Was this really worth it? They had gone from issuing fines to potentially facing federal penalties. But the president, stubborn and prideful, doubled down. He insisted they had to win, no matter the cost. He argued that if they let one person break the rules, the whole neighborhood would fall apart. He treated the ramp like a symbol of rebellion, not a necessity for a man who couldn't walk. As the weeks passed, the case moved closer to trial. Court dates were set, depositions were scheduled, and the HOA's finances began to strain under the mounting legal bills. While the man's lawyer worked tirelessly, the HOA's attorney seemed increasingly desperate, trying to argue that aesthetics outweighed accessibility. It was a flimsy position, one that crumbled under even basic scrutiny. Meanwhile, the man's life was still overshadowed by the stress of the lawsuit. Every day, he rolled up and down that ramp, aware that it had become a battleground. Neighbors watched silently, some offering supportive nods when no board member was looking, others avoiding eye contact altogether. The cul-de-sac had grown tense. divided between those who saw the injustice and those who feared the wrath of the HOA. Through it all, he refused to back down. Each time he used the ramp, he was reminded why this fight mattered. It wasn't just for him, it was for anyone who had ever been told by a faceless bureaucracy that their needs were inconvenient. Then came the mediation meeting, a last attempt to resolve the dispute before trial. Both sides sat across from one another, the man with his attorney, the HOA president with theirs. The mediator asked if there was room for compromise, but compromise was impossible. The HOA demanded full removal of the ramp. The man's attorney demanded full compliance with disability law. The room grew tense as neither side budged. The mediator finally sighed, acknowledging that there would be no resolution here. The case was going to trial. The date was set. The man's ramp, the simple wooden structure built for necessity, was about to be argued over in a courtroom filled with lawyers, a judge, and possibly a jury. The stakes were no longer just fines or neighborhood gossip. The stakes were legal precedent, potential damages, and the reputation of the HOA itself. As the court date approached, the man felt a mixture of anxiety and resolve. The HOA had dragged him into this war, but he wasn't alone anymore. He had the law on his side, an attorney ready to fight, and the truth backing every step of his case. The HOA believed their rules were above everything, above compassion, above reason, even above federal law. But they were about to discover just how wrong they were. The trial was coming, and when the gavel finally struck, it wouldn't just decide the fate of a ramp. It would decide the fate of the entire HOA. The courthouse was a world far removed from the quiet suburban neighborhood where the fight had begun. Its marble floors, high ceilings, and stern atmosphere set the stage for a confrontation that had grown far larger than a simple ramp. On the morning of the trial, the man arrived in his wheelchair, his attorney at his side, carrying a binder packed with evidence. Across the aisle, the HOA's president and attorney waited, stone-faced, their posture suggesting confidence, but their eyes betraying unease. The judge presiding over the case was seasoned, known for cutting through theatrics to get to the heart of the matter. From the very beginning, it was clear that this wouldn't be an easy ride for the HOA. The judge emphasized that the law required reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. With those words, the tone of the trial shifted. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. It was about rights. The HOA's attorney opened first, painting the ramp as an unauthorized construction that violated the community's bylaws. He described how the ramp allegedly disrupted the uniform appearance of the neighborhood, claiming it set a dangerous precedent that would allow homeowners to disregard the rules. His argument leaned heavily on maintaining property values and enforcing community standards. He tried to present the case as one of order versus chaos, as if the ramp threatened to unravel the very fabric of suburban life. But as he spoke, the judge's expression remained impassive, neither swayed nor impressed. When it was time for the defense, the man's attorney rose with calm authority. She didn't need theatrics. She began with the facts. The man was disabled. The ramp was a necessity, and the HOA had repeatedly refused to grant a reasonable accommodation. She cited federal law, specifically the Fair Housing Act, which made it illegal to deny modifications needed for accessibility. She presented medical documents verifying his condition, photographs of the ramp proving it was safe and professionally constructed, and letters showing how the HOA ignored his pleas. Then came the most damning piece of evidence. The attorney revealed copies of internal emails that had surfaced during discovery. In those messages, the HOA president had openly mocked the man's disability, calling the ramp ugly and insisting it be removed to keep the neighborhood looking proper. One email even bragged that they needed to make an example out of him. The courtroom fell silent as the words were read aloud. The judge's expression hardened. The HOA president shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier bravado evaporating. The attorney seized the moment, driving home her point. This wasn't about rules or property values. This was about discrimination. Over the course of several days, witnesses were called. Neighbors testified, some reluctantly, others passionately. A few admitted they felt pressured by the HOA to stay silent, while others confessed they saw the ramp as nothing more than a necessary structure. Experts were brought in, including an accessibility consultant who confirmed that the ramp complied with safety standards. Each testimony chipped away at the HOA's case, revealing it for what it truly was, a vendetta fueled by arrogance and bias. The HOA's defense grew weaker with each passing day. Their attorney tried to argue that bylaws were binding contracts and that exceptions would undermine their authority. But every time he made this point, the man's attorney countered with federal law, reminding the court that no community rule could override disability rights. The judge nodded in agreement more than once, making it clear where his sympathies lay. As the trial neared its end, the man sat quietly, absorbing every moment. For months, the ramp had been a source of stress and conflict. Now, in this courtroom, it had become the centerpiece of justice. He realized he was indeed just fighting for himself. He was fighting for countless others who had been bullied by HOAs hiding behind bylaws. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. The HOA's attorney repeated his points about order and appearance, but the words rang hollow. When the man's attorney spoke, her words carried weight. She reminded the court of the purpose of accessibility laws, of the dignity owed to every person, and of the blatant disregard shown by the HOA. She ended with a simple truth. This ramp is not an eyesore, it is freedom, and the law protects that freedom. The courtroom was quiet as the judge retired to deliberate. Hours felt like days. The HOA president paced nervously, whispering with his attorney. The man waited in silence, steady but anxious, knowing everything hung on the judge's decision. When the judge finally returned, the room stiffened. He looked at the papers before him, then addressed both sides. His verdict was clear and firm. The HOA had discriminated against the man by refusing a reasonable accommodation. The ramp would stay. The fines and liens issued by the HOA were declared null and void. And beyond that, the HOA was ordered to pay damages for emotional distress and legal fees. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The man sat stunned, relief flooding over him. His attorney placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Across the aisle, the HOA president's face turned pale, his arrogance collapsing into disbelief. They had lost, and not just lost, they had been humiliated. But this was only the beginning. The verdict would have lasting consequences, not just for the man and his ramp, but for the entire neighborhood, and for the HOA itself. The courtroom verdict hit the neighborhood like a thunderclap. For months, residents had watched the battle quietly, many keeping their opinions guarded, afraid of the HOA's influence. But once the judge's ruling became public, silence was no longer possible. Word spread quickly. The HOA had lost. And not only had they lost, they were ordered to pay damages and cover the man's legal fees. The financial blow landed immediately. The HOA's legal costs had already drained a significant portion of the association's reserve funds, money that was supposed to be used for community maintenance and improvements. Now, with the added burden of damages and attorney fees, the board faced a crisis. There simply wasn't enough left in the budget. To cover the costs, they announced a special assessment, an extra fee to be paid by every homeowner in the community. The reaction was explosive. Residents, who had quietly tolerated the board's overreach for years, suddenly found themselves footing the bill for a lawsuit many believed should never have happened. Homeowners' meetings, once sparsely attended, became standing room only affairs filled with shouting, accusations, and finger. Neighbors who had once smiled politely at one another now openly argued in driveways. The HOA had claimed the ramp would lower property values, but now it was their actions that had done the damage. Inside the board itself, fractures widened. Some members blamed the president for pushing too hard, refusing to compromise, and dragging the community into a public spectacle. Others, still clinging to the illusion of authority, tried to defend their stance, arguing that they had only been enforcing the rules. But the evidence of their failure was undeniable. Their pride had cost the entire neighborhood thousands of dollars. Not to mention their collective reputation. The HOA president, once a figure of intimidation in the cul-de-sac, now found himself isolated. Residents who once followed his lead avoided him in public, whispering about his arrogance and poor judgment. At meetings, people demanded his resignation, shouting over his attempts to regain control. He resisted at first, refusing to step down, but the pressure mounted with each passing week. By the end of the month, even his closest allies on the board turned against him. Under a wave of community outrage, he resigned, his power stripped away as quickly as it had been wielded. Meanwhile, the man at the center of the storm became something of an unexpected hero in the neighborhood. People who had previously stayed silent began approaching him, offering apologies for not speaking up sooner. Some admitted they had been intimidated by the HOA's tactics, afraid of fines or retaliation. Others simply thanked him for standing up, not just for himself, but for everyone. His ramp, once the target of scorn, became a quiet symbol of resistance. But victory didn't erase the damage entirely. The stress of the lawsuit lingered, etched into the man's life like a scar. There were still whispers from a few bitter neighbors who resented the costs they now had to pay, blaming him instead of the board. And though the ramp remained, each time he rolled down it, he felt the weight of the battle that had secured its place. The HOA scrambled to repair its image, sending out polished newsletters full of promises to learn from the past and move forward as a stronger community. But the trust was broken. Homeowners began questioning every rule, every decision, and every dollar spent. Attendance at meetings stayed high, not because people wanted to participate, but because they no longer trusted the board to act without oversight. The local news even picked up the story. A segment aired with the headline, "Wheelchair Ramp Lawsuit Exposes HOA Overreach." The coverage painted the man in a sympathetic light, while portraying the HOA as a cautionary tale of power gone unchecked. Calls and emails poured into the HOA office from outside communities, some praising the man for standing up, others criticizing the board for their cruelty. The neighborhood's once pristine reputation was tarnished beyond repair. For the man, however, the most important outcome was personal. He could leave his home freely now, without fear of fines, threats, or legal retaliation. The ramp stood proudly at the entrance, not just as a means of accessibility, but as a monument to his resilience. He had faced down an entire board of neighbors, armed only with truth and the law, and won. Still, the story wasn't over. The HOA's finances remained in shambles. The special assessment barely covered the damages, and now the community faced delayed maintenance, crumbling sidewalks, and postponed projects. Frustrations simmered, and the question of who would step up to lead the HOA remained unanswered. New elections loomed, and candidates emerged with promises of reform, transparency, and compassion. But the scars of the battle were deep. The neighborhood was divided, some still bitter, others hopeful for change. The man, though relieved to be free from the HOA's grasp, couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. He had won his case, but the board wasn't entirely gone, just weakened, reshuffled, and angry. And sometimes, anger doesn't fade quietly. The resignation of the HOA president had been a public spectacle, but his departure didn't erase the culture he had built within the board. Even without him at the helm, bitterness lingered among the diehards who had supported his crusade against the ramp. They had been humiliated in court, forced to swallow the verdict, and stripped of credibility in front of the entire neighborhood. But people like that rarely let go quietly. At first, their retaliation was subtle. The man noticed that his mailbox began to fill with anonymous notes, scrawled words accusing him of being selfish, of costing the community thousands, of ruining the neighborhood. His trash bins were mysteriously tipped over more than once. His lawn service received strange cancellations he hadn't made, and petty complaints were filed about his property, ranging from grass to lawn decorations out of season. None of these complaints had teeth, but they served a purpose: harassment. It was an attempt to wear him down, to remind him that although he had won in court, he was still surrounded by people who despised him. But this time, he wasn't alone. Neighbors who had once been silent now stood beside him. A small but vocal group formed around him, frustrated by years of the HOA's bullying and emboldened by his victory. They attended board meetings in packs, demanding accountability. Whenever a baseless complaint was filed against him, they were writing letters of support and calling out the pettiness for what it was. The board, under new leadership, was caught in a tug-of-war. On one side were the reformers, eager to restore trust and focus on real community improvements. On the other were the loyalists of the old regime, still nursing their wounds, clinging to rules as weapons, desperate to reassert control. The meetings turned into battlegrounds, filled with shouting, matches, and votes that split down the middle. The man stayed quiet during these conflicts, but his presence loomed over every decision. His victory had emboldened the reformers and discredited the hardliners. Each time the old guard tried to tighten control, residents brought up the lawsuit, reminding everyone how much money and dignity had been lost because of their The phrase "don't start another ramp situation" became shorthand for warning against overreach. The bitterness from the old guard, however, refused to die. Rumors began circulating, claims that the man had exaggerated his disability, that he could walk just fine if he wanted to, that the lawsuit was nothing more than a money grab. These whispers spread at backyard barbecues, at school pickup lines, and in hushed conversations at the community pool. It was character assassination, an attempt to erase the legitimacy of his struggle. But evidence was on his side. And so was the law. Every attempt to undermine him backfired, drawing more sympathy from those who saw through the smear campaign. The local news had covered his story once already, and when the rumors began to spread, a follow-up piece aired. This time, it focused on the harassment he faced after his legal victory. The coverage painted the HOA loyalists as spiteful and petty, and public opinion shifted even more firmly in his favor. Meanwhile, the financial pain caused by the lawsuit continued to ripple through the community. The special assessment was only the beginning. Routine maintenance was delayed again, and property values began to dip, not because of the ramp, but because potential buyers were wary of buying into a neighborhood infamous for its HOA scandal. Realtors quietly warned clients about the ramp case, and online forums buzzed with stories about the HOA's downfall. The old guard tried to blame him for all of it, but each accusation rang hollow. The truth was plain. The HOA had chosen this fight, and the neighborhood was now paying for their arrogance. Through it all, the man held his head high. The ramp remained exactly where it was meant to be, sturdy and reliable. Every time he rolled down it, he did so with a quiet sense of triumph, knowing it symbolized not just his independence, but the futility of the HOA's vendetta. But even as he tried to move forward, the undercurrent of hostility refused to disappear. The loyalists were cornered, their influence waning, yet their anger only deepened. They had failed to crush him with rules, failed to bury him in court, and failed to smear his reputation. That kind of resentment doesn't simply fade away. And as the next election cycle for the HOA board approached, the man knew the final showdown was coming. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the soul of the neighborhood. Would it remain under the shadow of authoritarian rule, or would the reformers finally wrestle control once and for all? The ballots were being prepared. The campaigns had begun, and the fight that started with a simple wheelchair ramp was about to decide the future of an entire community. The months leading up to the HOA board election were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. For years, the association had been run with little challenge, meetings sparsely attended, decisions but now, after the lawsuit, the fines, the damages, and the public humiliation, people were paying attention. For the first time, the residents saw the HOA for what it had become, a machine of control rather than community, and they were ready for change. The reformers, emboldened by the man's victory, rallied around a slate of candidates who promised transparency, fairness, and a complete break from the old guard. Their campaign wasn't flashy, but it was grounded in a simple truth. No one should ever again suffer what the man had endured. They spoke openly about the lawsuit, about the wasted money, and about the arrogance of those who had dragged the neighborhood into disaster. The old guard, desperate to retain influence, ran their own candidates. Their message was familiar. Rules maintain order, and without them, the community would fall apart. But their words rang hollow. Every homeowner had already felt the financial sting of their decisions. Every resident had seen their reputation tarnished in local news stories, and every whisper campaign against the man had crumbled under scrutiny. Their candidates spoke with forced conviction, but their eyes betrayed fear. Election day arrived with an energy more intense than most national elections. Families walked to the clubhouse in clusters, ballots in hand, conversations buzzing about who would lead them into the future. The man watched it all quietly from his driveway, not running for office, not campaigning, but knowing his presence had shaped every single vote. His ramp stood behind him like a silent monument, a reminder of what was at stake. When the votes were counted, the result was overwhelming. The reformers swept the election, winning every contested seat. The old guard was wiped out in a single night, their years of unchecked control reduced to nothing. The room erupted in cheers, residents hugging one another, clapping, even crying. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. The NEA board's first order of business was symbolic but powerful. They passed a resolution affirming their commitment to inclusivity and accessibility. They rewrote policies to ensure accommodations would never again be denied. They pledged financial transparency, publishing every dollar spent. And they formally apologized to the man, acknowledging the harm done to him and thanking him for his courage. The change was not instantaneous, but it was real. Projects resumed, trust slowly rebuilt, and the neighborhood began to heal. The stain of the lawsuit would never fully fade, but in its place grew something stronger, a sense of resilience and unity forged through conflict. For the man, the end of the battle brought a peace he hadn't felt in years. No more letters stuffed into his mailbox. No more threats or anonymous notes. No more courtroom dates looming over his head. Just the simple, quiet dignity of living his life without interference. He could roll down his ramp and leave his home freely, not as a defiant act, but as a normal part of everyday life. He never sought to be a hero, but to his neighbors, that's what he became. Parents pointed him out to their children, telling them about the man who stood up for what was right. Younger families moving into the community heard the story, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in proud His fight became local legend, the moment the HOA's grip was broken, and the community reclaimed its voice. As months turned into years, the ramp weathered storms and seasons, standing strong, just as it had from the start. It was no longer a point of contention, no longer the subject of fines or lawsuits. It was simply part of the home, accepted and unremarkable, which was exactly what he had wanted all along. The HOA that once tried to destroy him had been dismantled from within, replaced by something more humane. And, while scars remained financial, emotional, reputational's neighborhood learned a lesson it would never forget. Power unchecked leads to arrogance, and arrogance always leads to downfall. The man often sat on his porch in the evenings, watching children ride their bikes and families walk their dogs, the cul-de-sac alive with life again. He thought back to the endless nights of worry, the courtroom tension, the humiliation and harassment, and then he thought about where it had all led. Here, to this moment, where peace was finally possible. The HOA had tried to ban his wheelchair ramp. They had dragged him into court, mocked his disability, and underestimated his resolve. They believed their rules were stronger than his rights. But in the end, they paid the price, not just in money, but in power, reputation, and control. And the ramp remained, standing as a silent testament to a simple truth. When you fight for what is right, no HOA, no president, and no bylaw can take that away.